Byline Audio.
¿Hablas español?
Sprichst du Deutsch?
¿Kann du Norsk?
If you've heard that sound from Babbel before, I bet you do. Babbel is the science-backed language learning app that actually works. With quick 10-minute lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts, Babbel gets you on your way to speaking a new language in just a few weeks. With over 16 million subscriptions sold and a 20-day money-back guarantee, just start speaking another language with Babbel. Right now, up to 55% off your Babbel subscription at babbel.com/Spotify podcast. Spelled BABBEL.com/Spotify podcast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
Hi there and welcome to the Byline podcast. This is Adrian Goldberg here, my second full day in Washington DC, reporting for you on the US election 2024, Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. And for the second day in a row, I'm sitting here in the shadow of that giant wedding cake of a building, the Capitol, which houses both the US Senate and the House of Representatives. And away to my left is the almost equally impressive US Supreme Court. And this is a city where you are never more than 50 yards away from a Roman column. So many huge, impressive buildings. I've got Tom Carter with me. Tom was a reporter for 25 years on the Washington Times and remains an acute observer of the Washington political scene and indeed of newspapers and the media in general. Tom, I want to talk about how the media is covering Harris versus Trump. To an outsider, this can feel like quite a forbidding town because there are these giant buildings that speak of power, that speak of empire. Where are the little cozy places where politicians come to break promises and trade secrets with a journalist like you?
Well, there are plenty of little neighborhoods around here with bars. There's a Chinese restaurant about 2 blocks from here that is just covered with pictures of Nancy Pelosi and other members of Congress. Usually what they do when they're here late at night working on some important something, they'll do tons and tons of takeout, and that's the Chinese go-to restaurant. I mean, and there's a couple of bars there, famous for reporters going to and hanging out. It looks more forbidding than it is. I feel the same way when I visit London. It's completely intimidating to me, but once you get around and you understand how the tube works and so forth, you can get around. And there are plenty of nice bars and pubs to get to.
And you're totally absorbed in this city. You live on Capitol Hill. You're still very closely in touch with what goes on here and follow the debates closely. Again, an amazing address to say that you live on Capitol Hill.
Yeah, I live about a mile from here. The Capitol and this whole area is where I go for my regular runs. I've run around this Capitol thousands and thousands of times. Yeah, this is my neighborhood. Most of my neighbors are Hill staffers or lawyers with big lobbying groups, that sort of thing. So, yeah, completely immersed in D.C. here.
And you work for the Washington Times.
That's correct.
So let's understand what kind of newspaper that is or that was in your time working on it, because you were telling me just before we started recording that the Washington Times has changed quite significantly.
It was always a conservative newspaper. I was on the foreign desk, and so I didn't really have to deal very much with, the politics of left and right. I just wrote my stories, and editors pretty much left me alone. But around 2005-06, it made a hard turn right, anti-immigration right, and it went from pretty much normal conservative like Mitt Romney and John McCain conservative to, Trump wasn't around then, but Trumpy conservative, very, very hard right, and that was too much for me. I didn't want to work for a paper like that, so I looked for another job and moved on.
What drove that then, given that it was pre-Trump? Because that suggests that there was something in the air, something in the water, even before Trump came along, perhaps to crystallize that change, which suggested that something was afoot, arguably something amiss in America.
Oh, well, specifically what drove that particular thing for me was there's a man, his name is John Tanton, And he is sort of the father, the puppet master of all of the anti-immigration groups in the United States. He had about 10, 15, maybe 20 different anti-immigration groups, all doing different things, but all funded and staffed by this John Tanton anti-immigration organization. And the Washington Times became very much a place where they would put op-eds, where their people would be interviewed and that sort of thing. I'd never heard of them, but once I started digging into it a little bit, I was quite surprised at how far right they were, and it wasn't a place for me.
And as we're speaking here, just a few days out from the election, Trump is majoring on immigration. Some of his advisors are telling him to look at the economy, to focus on that, but he is majoring on immigration, much as he has done throughout his political career. It always intrigues me that the United States is, by definition, a nation built on immigration.
Absolutely.
How do we explain this animus towards immigration in this country, of all countries of the world? A country where people fled from the United Kingdom to seek religious freedom, where people fled from Ireland to escape poverty following the famine, a place where Jews fled from Eastern Europe to avoid the pogroms. How is it that this place becomes anti-immigration?
Well, I think a lot of people are concerned about change. And like in the UK with Brexit and Nigel Farage, they don't like change. They don't like seeing their lily white neighborhood that they grew up in the 50s and maybe 40s, whatever. And now they've got Indians and Pakistanis and Indonesians and, in our case, Mexicans and Haitians and others living next door. And change is not something that is easy, especially for older people. In particular, in this country, older white people.
But as you say, there are forces afoot as well that have sought to exploit that and sought to make the most of that, perhaps natural fear.
Oh yeah, I think that's exactly correct. I mentioned John Tanton earlier. He used to be considered a fringe crazy, and his groups were considered fringe and crazy. Steve Miller, who is one of Trump's architects of the anti-immigration stuff, came out of that milieu, and others as well. A guy named Ken Cuccinelli. You know, the demographics of this country have changed in the last 20, 30 years, and some people are uncomfortable with that. I mean, the anti-immigration sentiment has always been there. I mean, before it was anti-Germans or anti-Irish, 100 years ago. Now it's Mexicans and Haitians and Venezuelans or, brown people. So,
let's talk about how the media has covered and is covering this election. Here in Washington, the Washington Post, which, with all due respect to your old paper, the Washington Times, the Post is perhaps seen as the newspaper that speaks to the United States about what's going on here in the Capitol. And the Washington Post, traditionally Democrat-leaning, traditionally at this point in the election cycle, would make a recommendation to its readers about who to vote for. Now it's owned by Jeff Bezos, the owner of Amazon, and very controversially, the Washington Post has decided that it will not back a candidate. It won't back Harris, but it won't back anybody publicly.
Well, sins of omission, silence is its own sort of endorsement. The Washington Post is clearly the most important, most respected, most prestigious newspaper in Washington, D.C. Maybe the New York Times as well, but that's a New York newspaper. But for our local newspaper, local sports, local news, and politics, this is the center. New York Times, you could say, is the center of the economic world with Wall Street and so forth. We're the center of the political world, and the Washington Post has been the big dog newspaper in that context. Best known for Watergate. They forced President Nixon to resign. At the same time, the Pentagon Papers. The New York Times wanted to publish the Pentagon Papers. This is back in the Vietnam War era. They were told that they couldn't do it, that it was against the law. And so the Washington Post got those same Pentagon Papers. They were told, if you publish this, reporters and editors are going to go to jail. They said, we're going to do it anyway. They did. That's the Washington Post that I know and remember and love. Not endorsing this time is in fact a tacit endorsement, in my opinion, of Donald Trump. Jeff Bezos, who you mentioned, owns Amazon, who along with Elon Musk has technology and interests in going to space. A couple of hours after they announced that they weren't going to endorse anybody, Jeff Bezos executives were meeting with Elon Musk executives talking about their next venture. I mean, it really does look like Bezos is hedging his bet. He's thinking Trump will become president, and if I endorse Kamala, I'm going to run into business trouble. I'm going to lose money. But how many billions does the guy need? I mean, really? It's caused a huge problem here in D.C. I have Washington Post reporter friends who are just gutted that this happened and so upset in so many ways, because generally speaking, they do really good work. They do really important work, and this non-endorsement has really hurt them badly. I think, I don't know permanently, but it's going to take years to get over this reputational tragedy that they're going through right now.
Yes, I know that the editor at large resigned in the aftermath.
2 or 3 editors resigned.
Yeah. So it's a big deal, clearly, if people are giving up their jobs for it. And of course, you might say, well, look, people don't need a newspaper to tell them who to vote for. They know that the Post is perhaps Democrat-leaning in
Absolutely.
any event.
Yeah.
But it's more about what it says about the institution itself, that having done this historically, now it's not doing it, and that sends out its own signal.
Yeah, I think it was Martin Luther King said, when it's all over, it's not the stings and barbs of our enemies that we're going to remember, it's going to be the silence of our friends. A number of very conservative, right-wing, stinking rich, filthy rich billionaires are behind Trump because he said he will cut their taxes and he will end government regulation of their businesses so that they don't have to worry about climate change or polluting the air or polluting the streams. A friend of mine who's a lawyer, works here on the Hill, said libertarian billionaires, the Kochs, the Scaife, the Ulines, Bezos, Barry Side, they want to roll back all of the progress of the 20th century. They're opposed to Obamacare. They're opposed to Social Security. They're opposed to Medicare and Medicaid. They don't want to pay their fair share in society, so no taxes, no regulations.
You've talked to me as well before we started recording about the New York Times, another influential US newspaper.
Well, the New York Times has endorsed Kamala, but for the past 6 months or year at least, their coverage of Trump and the entire election has been awful. As a reporter and newspaper person, you know reporters don't write their own headlines. They don't place the story on first page or on page 16 or whatever. That's done by other people. And the term that is being used in the media world here is called sanewashing. Trump has been so nuts. I mean, last night he was fantasizing about putting Liz Cheney in front of a firing squad for Pete's sake.
For having the temerity to say that she opposes his re-election.
This isn't the top story in the New York Times this morning. It's on the front page, but it's a couple of things down. I mean, it's so crazy. And I mean, there were tens of thousands of lies the Washington Post documented during Trump's first term. I mean, news is what's new, you know, N-E-W. And Trump lying is not news. Therefore, ho, ho, hum, Trump told another whopper. Whereas Kamala has to be absolutely perfect. I mean, it's crazy that this past weekend, Trump held a huge rally in Madison Square Garden, mimicking the Nazi rallies in Madison Square Garden of 1939. And people said Puerto Rico is a floating island of garbage and, you know, that sort of stuff. But then Kamala has her rally on the mall right down here. My wife and I went. 75,000 people. It was really amazing. And rather than that being the top story was Biden had a senior moment, and which I have many of myself, and made a verbal slip where he seemed to be saying Trump people are garbage. Well, he didn't say that at all, and he didn't mean that at all, and he's not running for president. And Kamala has made very clear on the Mall she wants to be the president of all people. You know, Trump says his opposition are the enemies within, and he wants to lock them up. So, I mean, there's a huge difference, and the way the newspapers are playing this is crazy. And in my opinion, I mean, if you look back into the New York Times reporting in the 1930s, Nazi Germany, I mean, Hitler was a weird guy, and they said some bad things, but they soft pedaled it a lot. You know, they missed it, and we all know what happened then. I think, this is my personal opinion as a reporter for 25 years and in journalism world, I mean, I've covered difficult places. Haiti, Cuba, Nicaragua, difficult places. I always tried to be fair. I always tried to give both sides their say accurately. I think we're in a different era now, and democracy is on the line. If this election, which is very close, I cannot believe it, but it's very close, goes to Trump, there may not be another election. I mean, the gerrymandering, the voter suppression, and the Supreme Court, which has given the president immunity for all his official acts, including, as Sotomayor said, he could send a hit team out to kill his opposition, and that would be covered. I mean, it's insane. And the New York Times and other newspapers, Washington Post and others, doing what is sometimes referred to as both sidesism. You got to pick a side. We're not in, those days anymore where everything can be la-ti-da and fun.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that as you were describing this process of sanewashing, which I think is a fantastic phrase, and making the insane appear normal, which I think is what you're suggesting there. We had a very similar thing in the UK over Brexit, both sidesism, treating both sides of an argument as if they are of equal weight and of equal value, but a politician who talks about shooting his rivals, he may argue in jest, not very funny really, but who talks about their opponents as the enemy within, I'd suggest there's a very strong argument for saying that there is no kind of political balance you can strike there.
No. The Washington Post, the New York Times, other newspapers have to pick a side. And I had a discussion with a Reuters reporter 2 days ago, 20 meters from here, and he said, well, we try to play it straight. Well, fair enough, but if one side says it's sunshiny and the other side said it's raining, a reporter has the responsibility to look out the window and see which one is true.
Of course, many people these days, the majority, get their news from social media. For many people, that is the primary source of their news. And although X is by no means the biggest player in terms of social media, it is perhaps the one that deals most with news and current affairs. And Elon Musk makes no secret of his desire to see Trump elected.
Well, Twitter, or now X, used to be the public square for journalists, policymakers, pundits, lobbyists, everybody. And if something happened, it was immediately on Twitter, and people in that space would know about it immediately. Musk bought it and has pretty much burned it to the ground. I'm on there because there's nothing else equal. I have a very small account, 6,000 followers maybe, of which now, because Musk throttles some of the stuff that I'm posting, I think maybe 10 people see my stuff. It's really, you can post it and there will be no response for
because
hours.
He tweaks the algorithm or ensures that
Exactly.
his operatives tweak the algorithm.
Exactly. The people I want to follow, I literally have to go on to Twitter every 2 or 3 days, search their accounts, pull them up, click on 2 or 3 things, and hope that the algorithm will see that I'm paying attention to them and they will show up in my timeline. It's really a terrible, almost useless place now.
To hear somebody of your experience and your standing in this town talking about this election if Trump wins, possibly being the last presidential election, I think there will be listeners in the UK, perhaps listeners in the United States, who think that is just alarmist. It is such a big statement to make.
Well, I think if you go to Weimar Germany in the 30s, people were sitting around. Oh, is Hitler, does he really mean this stuff? I mean, do the people around him, are they really that crazy? Well, no, I've been a German for 10 generations and I speak perfect German. I love my country and I work in an important job. This can't possibly happen. Well, it did, and it can definitely happen here. And it's not even invisible. I mean, it's right there. When people tell you who they are, you should believe them. And not only that, we have Trump's first 4 years to look at. He was surrounded by amateurs at that time. This time is different. The Heritage Foundation, which is about, a block that way, is a conservative organization, was very much Chamber of Commerce Republicans when it was founded years ago, has gone full on Trump. They have a 900-page plan that details exactly what they are going to do.
Project 2025.
Project 2025. It's run by Leonard Leo surrogates, a guy named Kevin Roberts, Robert George.
Leonard Leo's another right-wing funder of...
Well, Leonard Leo is the man credited with putting 6 far-right extremist Catholics on the Supreme Court. Opus Dei Catholics to some degree or another. Gareth Gore's book, Opus, talks a great deal about that. And he has incredible influence at the Heritage Foundation. Rebecca Mercer is one of the people on the trustees that hired Kevin Roberts. She was involved with Cambridge Analytica and Brexit and all that kind of stuff. These are extremely wealthy people that can literally throw billions at projects that they are interested in. So anyway, you've got a 900-page plan that what they want to do. They want to deport millions of people, which Trump has said dozens and dozens of times. They want to create something for the president to invoke something called Schedule F, which means no government employee has any job security whatsoever and can be fired overnight at will. And the Trump people and the Project 2025 people call that the deep state. They keep saying this is the deep state. This is what thwarted us from doing all of our stuff before. And so they want to get rid of the deep state. We're talking 50, 100,000 U.S. employees, tens of thousands of them here in Washington, D.C. could be fired overnight. They want to get rid of the Department of Education. It's just nuts. They want to make abortion and contraception banned, not just in states, but federally banned. Gay couples have the right to get married and have the same protections. That will be gone. It's just dystopian, Handmaid's Tale stuff.
And they will rejoinder that Kamala Harris is a communist. And I discussed with Peter Dukes yesterday that it takes a very particular prism to see Kamala Harris as a communist.
Well, anyone who doesn't think along these same lines is considered a communist. I have very close friends, or used to be, from college, 50-year friends calling me a communist. And I said I worked at a conservative newspaper. I was a Republican. To call me a communist is just insane. On the European scale, I'm a very middle-of-the-road, even conservative liberal. I mean, I believe that guns should be regulated. I believe that it shouldn't bankrupt you if you have a health problem. Just common sense stuff. I believe the rich should pay their fair share in taxes.
Commie. Listen, Tom, it's been great to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me, and pray for us.
Before we go, just to say, by the way, if you've enjoyed listening to this conversation, don't forget to support the Byline Times. It's our fantastic monthly news periodical, which contains the best of our online articles with original content that you can't read anywhere else. So do head over to our news-breaking website, bylinetimes.com. That's bylinetimes.com, and take out a subscription to the Byline Times. You won't regret it, and you'll be helping to support this podcast as well. Thanks very much indeed for listening. We'll see you again soon. Cheers now. Bye-bye.
Byline Audio.